Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode of what are we on now? 87 of SCOTONOMICS. Thanks very much for joining us. Unfortunately, Colleen and I did an interview about 2 weeks ago, and it was deleted from our server after editing everything and getting it ready to go. So I'm really sorry that we haven't got Colleen with us. I spoke to her when I realised that episode had gone, and she said she'd try her very best to join us live, but unfortunately she just got other priorities today. So she asked me to pass on her apologies, but it's really my fault for not downloading it before someone decided to delete it. And that person wasn't Kairin, by the way, in case you're like, Kairin deleted it. But I'm really pleased that Kairin's able to join us tonight, and we're going to talk about degrowth and MMT, because I'm sure you are regular viewers and listeners know that those are the two topics that we cover most within that kind of broad scope of what we cover on the show. So hopefully we should be able to answer any of your questions, any comments around degrowth and MMT. Now, Colleen's paper was one of, I would say, very few papers that looked to link degrowth and MMT. For me and for Kairin, it's been something that I think is really natural, and they seem to intertwine really well. But it's been really interesting to see there hasn't been much kind of academic work on drawing these two things together. So Colleen's paper did that, and we're going to talk about that towards the end. But we both thought probably the best place to start was with a kind of overview again of what MMT is and what degrowth is, and then we can talk about how we think they interlink really well. So that's what we're going to do tonight. Thanks for joining us, Kairin. Why don't we start with you covering your view of MMT, and then I'll do the degrowth, and I'll watch out for any questions. So at any point, if you do want a clarification or you want to drop in a question, then please do that, and I'll make sure we answer it. Okay, go. You first, Kairin. MMT.
Yeah, MMT. So there are several scholars that have been pushing this idea for a long time. And what I would say MMT is doing is it's modern monetary theory. So it's pointing out to people that we no longer live in a gold standard world. We're not currency constrained, we're resource constrained. And many of the MMT scholars understand that we are resource constrained on a deeply fundamental ecological worrying level. Many of them are aware of this, although I would say that's not the case for all MMT scholars as well. I had a bit of a discussion with a Green MSP at the weekend, and it was clear for her that many of the MMT scholars consider that rampant consumerism is a possibility if you consider that the government is not currency constrained. Whereas, if you really listen to what the MMT scholars are saying, they're making it very clear that they're not currency constrained, they're resource constrained. And with that understanding, you then follow up with that understanding is that with that restriction of resources, there is always the possibility of inflationary pressure. And this is the thing that politicians who are in charge of central banks have to think about. There is no policy with MMT. It is a lens to look through the economy from this fiat currency view, what the possibilities are for your economy. They promulgate one policy, and that's a job guarantee. And that's with the thinking that if the currency issuer is taxing you, which is the other big policy tool that currency issuers have, they are also then responsible to ensure that you are employed, because they essentially make you unemployed by creating taxation of any kind. Would you agree with that? What do you think? Would you add to that?
Yeah. I'll add a little bit to that, I think, as we go through. But I thought that was a really good summary. We've got a question first from Hashbury, who said, "Can you explain resource constant?" And I think it's resource constrained. I think Hashbury, you meant to type in there. But yeah, what does that mean when we're talking about MMT says we're not kind of fiscally restrained, we're resource constrained?
Yeah, so on a very fundamental level, in Scotland, you have lots of resources. We're very lucky here. We have lots of energy, but we perhaps don't have every single resource. For example, in America, they're very resource rich, but they might not have every single resource. So what you have to bear in mind is that on an international level, you will be trading with other nations You might be sovereign in some ways, but you probably won't be sovereign in other ways. But the other thing to really bear in mind as well, and this is what we discussed last week with donut economics, we are pushing at the planetary boundaries of our resources. And I think for you and me, and for many other people, we understand that in Northern Europe, we've been very lucky with what we've had, and we need to maybe constrain our resource use so that poorer people on the planet don't have to.
Okay, great. Okay, yep. And Hashbury, I would say, when we're speaking about, we normally talk about government spending, that if we spend too much, it creates inflation, and that government shouldn't spend a lot of money because it's likely to raise the overall price level beyond what we can afford. And that idea of resource constraint means that actually the government is looking at it and saying, well, we can afford to pay for everything that we can pay British pounds for in the economy. That's the constraint, that we can't spend more than that, because if we spend more than that, then we would theoretically cause inflation. But we can spend up into a point where we can no longer find resources that we can buy for in pounds, and that's the constraint. So it's a resource constraint rather than being a kind of artificial price level constraint. So that's quite different from the traditional view of how much money a government can spend.
I think it's also, I want to interject here, because I think it's an important point to bring across the audience as well, is that another MMT scholar put this very succinctly: it's not money creation that causes inflation, it's spending. And so it's where that money goes. So for example, if you're creating money, for example, in the case of bonds, and you're giving interest to people who are saving that money, if they're not spending it in the economy, then it's not going to create inflation. But as we've seen in the UK, we have seen the inflation of house prices as many investors look for safer investment instruments, mainly housing and buildings.
Yeah, and one thing that I don't think they went into enough detail in the paper, which we'll cover, but I think it's important to mention now, is that inflation, when we're talking about inflation, what we're actually talking about is certain prices rising. And what we tend to do is look at inflation as like a macro policy and think, oh, price rises across the economy are rising. And actually what we need to do is to look at what prices are rising, why are they rising, who is benefiting from those rises, and actually start to target that. So we were just giving you the kind of how the traditional economic view looks at spending by the government and that it causes inflation. There's also other issues that they've got with it, this idea of it pushing out private investment, and for some reason private expenditure is better than public expenditure. These are all the things that are kind of wrapped up in this neoclassical, neoliberal view of the economy. So in summary then, I agree with you, and it was different from the paper. I think MMT has one clear policy, and that is the job guarantee scheme. But the paper did talk about a few more, and we're going to cover that in a little bit more detail. So in terms of
what is degrowth? Yes, so you're going to cover this, yeah.
Yes, so degrowth, which we've covered a few times on here and also in our articles in the National, and one thing that's similar between MMT and degrowth is they both focus on principally monetary sovereign governments, which tend to be governments in the global north. So they tend to be the wealthier economies. So a lot of people, when you're talking about degrowth, think you're talking about smaller, poorer economies degrowing as well. And it's the same with MMT. When we talk about MMT and government to be able to spend, it tends to only be monetary sovereign governments that we're talking about. And you have a higher level of monetary sovereignty, tends to have a higher level if you're a global north economy. So there's a real connection between the two of them. So when we're talking about degrowth, we're talking about the wealthy global north. And ostensibly, we're looking at their economies to scale down certain industries and build up other industries, but overall we're looking at the economies to effectively shrink its material consumption. And we talk about degrowth and degrowth from GDP because GDP is a measurement of material consumption, and what degrowth is saying is that we have to shrink that material consumption, and probably almost kind of by definition, if you're shrinking material consumption, then GDP is going to shrink, and that's where kind of degrowth comes from. But really, it's that we've got to pursue policies that reduce material consumption and increase our well-being. That's the idea of degrowth.
Yeah, and what do you think the crossovers are between MMT and degrowth?
So I definitely think that there's a focus on, as I said, these kind of richer economies. So I think that's really important. But they both come from the same kind of part of the heterodox economic view, and they're both kind of, it's called post-Keynesian, and I think they're both kind of sprung from post-Keynesian. And I would say the ecological economics has kind of been the birth to the degrowth movement, but they're both very similar heterodox schools. So they're looking at the world from a very different perspective than what we have as a mainstream, a kind of orthodoxy or a neoliberal. So they're both kind of friends in economic sense. So they both, I think, fundamentally look at this idea that there's a point where you can satisfy your needs. And neoclassical economics talks about us as kind of like some kind of, always think of this kind of drugged, dazed, absolute rapacious kind of person who's just got these insatiable needs and desires. And that's kind of what orthodox economics is built on. And heterodox economics kind of says, do you know what? Most people at some point are kind of content with a lot of things. They're content, and they start looking at things that they need rather than things that they want. And degrowth and MMT both look at it through this perspective that there's some point where everyone's really happy with what they've got. And I think capitalism needs that kind of idea of this rapacious beast who just continues to grab everything. So there's a really good perspective, I think, on MMT and degrowth that comes from that idea that our wants are not insatiable. And I think MMT supports that, and I think degrowth supports that. So I think that's one really clear part where we can start looking at these two areas. But there's a lot of areas that are covered in the paper that aren't covered in that much detail, where there's some crossover. And I think this paper that we're going to cover at the end gets into that. So a lot in common, but I think there's a lot of things still to be meshed together. But I think they're certainly willing to get round and talk to each other. And the title of Colleen's paper was how to pay for saving the world. And that's a bit of an economist in joke, because Keynes wrote a paper which was how to pay for the war.
Yeah.
So a few people, very smart. That I didn't get that straight away, I've got to admit. But yeah, so it's harking back to this kind of post-Keynesian idea of being able to pay for things that we need. Yeah, so the real crossover, I think, there.
And the other thing I wanted to ask you as well, because you're mingling with these people now, of course, how varied is the thinking of degrowth scholars?
Yeah, for me, the degrowth seems to be quite a cohesive unit, and I think it kind of focused around Jason Hickel, yeah, and I think that there's a wonderful scholar in Barcelona, and I think the degrowth movement seems to be quite small and tight and all focusing in the right way, whereas I think MMT is much more disparate. And I would say MMT has been, as a discipline, it's 25, if not 30 years old, whereas degrowth seems to be something that's been around for probably less than 2 decades, I think. So MMT, there seems to be much more disparate ideas, and I think Colleen in our paper drew a lot of policies together that I don't think exists as a kind of cohesive framework in MMT like it does in degrowth. So I think they all pretty much agree on where they're going. And I think within MMT, there's a group of academics who say, no, MMT is just this lens. And I think knowing some of them, I think they're all pretty progressive. But I think there's a lot of them who say, similar to what you've said, Kairin, and I said at the start, that there's a policy which is job guarantee, but that's to achieve full employment. Everything else, we're kind of staying out of that. And then I think there's other MMT academics, perhaps a little bit younger, who are saying, no, we need to say that MMT is actually much more policy focused now. And certainly that's where I'm going with my understanding of MMT. So I think there's a bit of I don't know whether or not it's a split, but I think there's definitely two different perspectives of MMT that don't exist in that degrowth movement.
And why do you think it's important for degrowth scholars to understand MMT?
When I was doing my green economics masters, there was so many times I would read a paper that would say, this is what we need to do, and here's how to fund it. And 9 times out of 10, it would say we have to raise taxes, or we have to stop spending on something else. And, you know, all these papers I was kind of saying, you've got all these ideas, but you're still stopping at this kind of neoclassical perspective of the economy. So I think there was so many good ideas, not just within degrowth, but within the scientific literature as a whole, that were just stymied by their misunderstanding of how the economy actually works. And that was really disappointing from someone who kind of understands MMT, who's looking at these scientific papers and saying, no, the constraint, as we said, Hashby, to answer your question again, the constraints, do you have the resources? That's the constraint, not can we afford the resources? Because if you're monetary sovereign, you can afford the resources. The government just creates a currency, buys it, and then uses it. So there was that real lack of understanding. And I think if we could get this through to the scientific community, that countries like the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, China, Great Britain are not currency constrained, then we can actually afford things a lot easier than they think. And I think that's absolutely crucial. And hopefully this paper, by kind of connecting the two of them, is starting to have those conversations. So that's why I think it's incredibly important for the degrowthers to understand what those real constraints are. And principally, this idea that taxation doesn't pay for government spending. And to finish, I think it's because that's a really good question, Karen. And I think to finish here, what I think is really important is that you hear the arguments about the just transition or a net zero economy, and the complaint or the problem that you hear most often is that, well, how do we pay for it? And is it my government, is it my taxes that's going to pay for it? And I think if you go over that hurdle with people and you say to them, actually, it's not your taxes that's going to pay for it. The government is going to bring resources and it's going to use them, but it doesn't need your tax to do that. The tax base, you know, your taxes don't need to go up to do that. I think there's a little bit of a less resistance. So I think it's really important, because that seems to stymie the discussions all the time around this idea of, well, who's going to pay for, you know, who's going to pay for a livable, survivable planet? You know, as ridiculous a question as that sounds, you know, people do think it's going to be them through their taxes.
Yeah, I did a talk to the Greens in Aberdeenshire soon after I moved back to Aberdeen, and you know that the problem with thinking that you have to raise taxes to deal with the climate crisis stymies your ambitions. As a green activist, as someone who cares about the environment and wants to see governments across the world do things about it, you know, the concept that governments are raising taxes for funds, or indeed creating bonds for funds, is it's, you know, it's for the birds. Yeah, you just have to fundamentally understand that the government is the currency issuer, and then from there all logic ensues, surely. The reason we tax is completely different. You know, we tax, and we should tax, to create more equality across our society. But of course, that's not what's happening in the UK. It's not what's happening in America. But it does happen in other countries. They do tax to ensure that their societies are much more equal, and therefore much more healthy and much more ecologically sound. There's a report on Radio Scotland this morning, and they're really pointing out just how much people with serious wealth are impacting on our planetary boundaries. And you know, it's really got to be curtailed, and governments have to be courageous about this, because literally the wealthiest in our society are going to kill us all. and I'm not being too dramatic about that. You know, we understand the science of climate change, and we know if we don't get serious about trying to deal with it, and you know, if you can't have that nice car that you wanted, then I'm sorry, you can't have it, because we need to live on a planet that's survivable first and foremost, rather than you having the latest trinket. so that's what's really important. Now, I know Colleen Schneider, the eco researcher that you were speaking to, she couldn't be with us, but you wanted to highlight some of the things from her paper, didn't you?
Yeah. Do you want to just have you got that? Have you got the introduction to her paper, Kairin?
Yes, so I'll read the introduction to the paper, and then you can go into the things that you really wanted to speak about with that. So she says degrowth lacks a theory of how the state can finance ambitious social ecological policies and public provisioning systems while maintaining macroeconomic stability during a reduction of economic activity. So I think that kind of covers it.
Okay, yeah, and what she's tried to do is to draw these two things together. And I would say that where I think it fits really well is that you covered it there. We need to move away from the idea of private consumption being the thing that drives our economy, because there's a huge amount of waste, and there's also a huge amount of part of that expenditure, which is what you could call ceremonial expenditure, rather than the other side to that, which is kind of instrumental expenditure. And private consumption, a lot of it is for show, and a lot of it isn't actually that beneficial for society, which is the ceremonial part of it. And governments, if it's the right government and it's run in the right way, when it spends the money that it spends is less ceremonial and more instrumental. So more of it is focused on goals and objectives and achieving kind of meaningful targets. And this is what I believe the power of government spending is, that it can be more used for instrumental purchasing rather than this idea of kind of conspicuous consumption or the ceremonial element of expenditure. And degrowth, that fits really, really well with degrowth, because what we're saying is we need to find the space in our economy where the government can spend more, and it can only do that if the private consumption comes down. So that's where I think there's a really, really good marrying of that, and that's, I think, the main thing that Colleen and her colleagues picked up. So as we said, they took quite a leap, as far as I'm concerned, in starting to put some more policies from MMT. And when I spoke to Colleen, I said, I hope you're right, and I hope this is where it goes, but I don't think it's fair at the moment to say that MMT supports price controls, credit regulation, and industrial policy, which you see on the chart here. So I think it's fair to say that degrowth is in favour of what we've got here: work time reduction, caps on resource use, taxing wealth and resources. All of those things are within the degrowth literature, but I didn't think those things in the top right-hand side were. Job guarantee, absolutely. And if you look at the policies of degrowth, probably the strongest policy that they support is a job guarantee. And there's actually a huge amount of academic support for a job guarantee, right from that whole kind of post-Keynesian economic school. MMT is that extension to that. Degrowth that comes from the kind of economical school. There's a huge agreement around the power of a job guarantee. So that was kind of where I first wanted to say is, I think that these policies, some MMT scholars would agree with. Certainly Fidel Kabud, who we've interviewed on the show and we're both really big fans of, talks about this idea of decolonization before decarbonization. And I think he's much more towards that kind of degrowth paradigm for MMT, and I think some other scholars aren't. So I really like this, because I think they tried the kind of image of it all fitting together. I really, really like. But that was the first ones they saw, where the degrowth policies fit in and where the MMT policies fit in there.
But again, I would, I really want to move away from the idea that MMT is a policy. I think that what we need is as many politicians as possible to understand what their responsibilities are when they become in the position of being the currency issuer, and also the deciders of taxation and which taxations will occur under their watch politically. And this is where the polity everyone who votes, everyone who gets involved in politics in any way has to really understand these concepts, because then they can push their politicians harder to achieve the things that we must achieve in the short space of time that we have to save our planet, for people to live within the planetary boundaries, to slow down the fires, to slow down the flooding. We really have to encourage as many people as possible to put pressure on politicians to really start doing the things that need to happen.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you 100% there. But where I disagree is that I think MMT should move much more into the policy space, because if you look at other schools of economics, they're all policy orientated, and MMT at the moment is sitting with one policy, where I think I'm encouraging it to move and say, if this is our view of the world and this is how we think it works, these are the policies that must come out of it. So I'm kind of, suggest, if you look at neoliberalism is set up to push its policies. And I think if we become too kind of, bland with MMT, and we just say, hey, this is how it works, it's down to you to work out how you do it, then I think it could land up with other policies coming out of that rather than the ones that we want. I've got a good question here from Hashbury, which I'm going to pull up. Could a basic citizen's income or universal basic income play a part in this, which I assume this being an economy that understands where money comes from and that achieves its within its planetary boundaries? Kairin, briefly, what's your answer to that?
Yeah, I used to be a fan of the citizens' basic income or universal basic income. Now that I understand what currencies are for, I'm not a fan of that. And so, no, I think why most people want to see this is because we have such an unfair social security system in the UK. And I think what people actually really want is a proper social security system that looks after people when they need to be looked after. I think the administering of a universal basic income becomes just as complex as social security when you look at all the different requirements, for example, whether you live in London or Edinburgh or Arbroath, there's going to be geographical complications. There are going to be complications if you are healthy or unhealthy, if you have children, your universal basic income really then becomes a different way of doing social security. And what we want in society is a good social security system that ensures that people are not living in an undignified way while they're in a situation where they don't have a job, but also that we have a job guarantee so that if they are able and they want to, they can always find work. And that's also available in their local area, so they don't have to take their children out of school, or they don't have to leave an elderly relative with someone who they don't know.
Yeah, really good answer to that. So Hashbury, both those schools of thought, MMT and Degrowth, neither of them suggest a basic income. They both fully support a job guarantee. We're going to do a lot more in the next few weeks. Well, actually in December, on detailing what the job guarantee scheme is. And I think it's important that we look at that compared to basic income, because it is something that kind of a lot of progressive people inherently support. And certainly I similar to you, Kairin, that's kind of something I instantly thought that's a really good idea. I think where I differ from a lot of MMT people is that I think there's a role for a basic income somewhere, and I'm not a huge fan of saying that policy won't work in all conditions and this policy will. So I'm still kind of a wee bit looking at where you can fit in a basic income, but certainly, with all other things being equal, I think a job guarantee scheme is far superior to that. Okay, what I thought would finish on is I'm just going to look at because there's some of the policies that Colleen came up with, and I think there's about 10, what's that, 8, 9, 10, 11 policies there. For anyone might know, we wrote an article probably about 2 months ago, and I came up with 25 degrowth policies. So I'm not trying to show off or anything, saying I got more, but I wanted to give a wider kind of scope of the type of policies. And what I wanted to do with this little list, so we're going to go through them very, very quickly, Kairin, was just to say you can see the MMT influence here, where I think it's really clear. So The first one's probably the most exciting: a less powerful and more democratic central bank.
Yeah.
Again, most MMT people wouldn't say that, but they would say, hey, the economy actually works better when a bank's independent, and when it has less power, because monetary policy is kind of overtaking the economy and not leaving room for fiscal spending. So I thought that was a kind of one of the clear MMT where you would get, people agreeing. No markets for natural resources. So this is an end to carbon markets. I've actually written a paper today about carbon markets and some of the problems that we have. So if you just go through that list, you can start to see there's a lot of crossover between the understanding of being monetary sovereign and the government being able to spend. Citizen assemblies is democracy, which again covers in degrowth, but I think comes into MMT. Public ownership of utilities, so there's another area that I think is clearly degrowth, but MMT a lot of people would agree with. Food sovereignty is one of the areas that Fidel Kabut is really strong on. Also kind of local expenditure and areas like that. And then you see right down the bottom there, you've got the right to work and job guarantee scheme, and also more powerful worker rights. So a lot of these policies are kind of clearly, I think, progressive and left. And MMT isn't positioning itself as that at the moment. It's still that kind of lens. And we've got limits for businesses and resource use and waste, energy efficiency targets, repair and replace products, so looking at the circular economy, and buying flanning within Scotland for business, so actually starting to look at particular consumption by the wealthy to be able to create space for the governments to spend this extra money. And then at the bottom, we've got a shift from taxing earnings from labour to taxing wealth. So you'll see again, a lot of those policies are principally focused on reducing inequality. And I think, again, that's something that kind of marries degrowth and MMT to, a slightly lesser extent, but I think there's a big focus from that kind of progressive collection of MMT academics that looks around inequality and making sure that we've all got similar or what we need in terms of resource use. So a lot of connections, and I thought Colleen's paper was really good for starting the discussion, which I think we really have to have a lot more, and not just the academic literature, but in the types of conversations that you were having with a green MSP who's clearly worried about our ecological footprint. And it's a shame that there isn't that understanding of the role of currency and the role of fiscal spending within that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Gregor. One thing I did want to say is that I think when we're looking at the degrowth policies and MMT, we really are looking at a very different way of viewing the economy. And this takes it out of this kind of growth paradigm that we're in at the moment. And I think, again, there's a lot of consistency that would come across MMT and Degrowth Scholars, that actually with this MMT lens, this pushes you away from this kind of growth paradigm, this neoliberal growth paradigm we have at the moment. So I think there's a lot to be brought together. Before we finish, any other questions? Anything else you want to go through, Kairin? Any questions or final thoughts or comments?
Oh, I would just say that actually I was cycling back to my friends. I'm staying in Edinburgh just now. That Radio Scotland actually were highlighting. I think it was a guy from Oxfam really talking about this thing of the wealthy in Scotland. Specifically, he was talking about the wealthy in Scotland and saying, they are consuming way too much, and it's really impacting on the rest of us and our safety and living on the planet. So, this idea has really come to the fore recently, and I'm really heartened to see it becoming a mainstream idea and hearing mainstream journalists talk about it. It's really good. I think we're getting there. I think we should have got there faster, but at least we seem to have arrived at this thinking that it's not all hair shirts. We've got to get serious about climate change, and we've got to get serious now.
Yeah, I think the figure from, I think it was an Oxfam figure today, was the top 1% release the same amount of emissions as the 66%.
About 66% of the rest of the population.
Yeah. So it's a huge disparity, and it's worth pointing out that even though we don't particularly think of ourselves as being particularly rich, in terms of the carbon that we're using is so much higher than the average. So we are sitting in Scotland, almost everyone was within the top 5% of the global population in terms of our wealth and our resource use. So I often say if there's equalising to happen, it's probably going to happen to everyone in Scotland, and we should start at the top first, before the top being the top in terms of their consumption, before we target people lower down in terms of the consumption. So yeah, it is really interesting and positive to see these conversations happening. Well, we hope this has been an interesting kind of an introduction again, or at least a bit of a conversation around how these two different ideals mash together. At this time next week, we're going to have an episode looking at our 4 articles that we've posted in the National this month, on a variety of different topics. So we're going to be pushing them out again on social media. It'd be great if you read them, and we'll be able to answer and have a discussion around those. And then we'll be back in December with some more live sessions. And we're also going to live stream a session from St Andrews University on the job guarantee scheme. I think that's the 9th of December, which is a Monday, and they've coincidentally dropped it in round about the time that we go live, Kairin. So that was very nice of them to do that, complete coincidence. I'm on the panel, I'm flying over to Scotland to take part in that, and we're going to stream that. So we're going to be covering a lot of the job guarantee in December and a few other things as well. So thanks everyone for joining us. I'm just going to highlight a few of Gregor's. Yes, absolutely. And that's to create much more space for people who don't have as much wealth or income. And we've got, and they need to pay more taxes. Yes, but as you know, Gregor, not to pay for stuff, but simply to improve quality, and everyone would need to consume. Yes. And I think that's really clear. And I'll finish with saying we live in a very exceptional time. The last 100 years, there's no other time on the planet where people have been able to use energy to create stuff to consume, and it's unlikely that that's ever going to happen again because of the damage that's happened. So we've got such an incredibly unique time, and we have to all realize that it's never going to be like it was for this kind of 100-year period when we've been consuming fossil fuels. So I agree completely, and I think that's a nice way to end that. We have had the best of what the earth has to offer, and things are going to change slightly over the next 100 years. Kairin, final thoughts before we head off?
Yeah, I'll just give you a little anecdote about what happened to me today. So I'm currently staying with my friends in Edinburgh. And if people know Edinburgh, it's when you're down in Ferry Road, where I'm staying just now, it's a big climb up the hill. So I've got my bike with me. I like to take it on the train and go and truck around Edinburgh. So I'm cycling up, and I come to a crossroads, and I get the green light, and off I go. Now I'm in a very low gear, remember, because it's a very, very steep hill. So I cross over the crossing very slowly because I'm in this low gear. And there's a guy waiting to come out, and he's got this very expensive car, the Elon Musk cars. I can't remember what they're called, Teslas. Yeah, he's got a Tesla, and it's one that I've never seen before. So it's clearly an expensive car. And he's about to run me over. And then I turn right, and then I keep going on, and he turns round, and he starts to chastise me when I'm on my bike, and it's just this not understanding of I can't go as fast as you. I'm using my legs. The food that I've eaten is making my legs work, and you're using a completely different form of energy, which it's not fair what you're expecting.
Okay, well, hopefully you can get the right gear to join us again this time next week. And look out for our article in the National tomorrow, which is going to talk about, Kairin.
Yes, I have been to the Breakup of Britain conference on Saturday. So that was quite interesting. So I'm going to write a little bit about that and some of the things I came across and the thinking that I came across there.
Fantastic. Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining us, and please do like and share and comment and follow the channel if you're new to us this evening. Very nice to see you all online. Thanks for your questions and your comments, and we'll see hopefully some of you this time next week. Bye for now.
Bye.